Okay, we are here, everybody. Hello, my name is Jim Shelvy, and I'm here with, am I going to say this right? Marcy Bursac.
You nailed it first time.
Perfect. No, it was not. I practiced it like 11 times. I watched a YouTube video with your name in it to make sure I got it right. I was well studied and prepared. But we are so excited to have you on here. You are officially honored and recognized as a change maker. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
But you knew that. You knew you were a change maker and a difference maker. And
Mm.
I don't mean that to sound like dismissive of it, but what you're doing is really amazing. And we have a global audience here, so not everybody's going to know your story. Can we start real quick with who you are, where you're from, all that good information?
Yeah, well, you nailed my name. So I'm Marcy Bursac. I'm from the St. Louis area. And what I'm doing is by day I have a corporate career, and I got really fed up with noticing a lack of marketing around the forgotten adoption option, which is foster care adoption. So last year in November, I launched a book by that name, The Forgotten Adoption Option. And then a month later, launched a podcast as a way to help 120,000 children in the United States be able to find their forever family.
So you and I spoke a little bit offline. I have history of knowing about adoption, and you've obviously made now a life commitment towards adoption, but it's bigger than that for you because you have a couple kiddos that you adopted. You want to share that story real quick?
Yeah, I do. I have a biological sibling set that I adopted through foster care. My daughter and I met when she was a week from being 3. My son was 4. And my husband and I, before we got married, knew that we did not want to try to have biological children. I don't even know if my body can. I recognize that some people have different motivations, but for us, it was that my husband's grandfather was orphaned in the 1920s in St. Louis. And when his parents had died, when Grandpa Sam's parents had died, the older brother and sister got adopted because they could help on a farm in the 20s, and Grandpa Sam could not. So Grandpa Sam was never adopted. And so my husband and I approached adoption as, how do we help kids that are older, that are often overlooked? How do we help them have a chance that Grandpa Sam never had? And for myself, I come from a big family. And so I was talking to my husband about, hey, if we're going to do this, like, I want to get siblings, because I can only imagine and never want to fathom what it would have been like for my 3 sisters and I to be separated in our childhood. So we ended up with adopting 2 kids.
Yeah, that's a great story. And there's so many. I want you to share some numbers. I think you already said 120,000 kids are part of the forgotten adoption option. But what percentage of kids that go from a foster care situation into adoption never get adopted? Do you know those numbers?
So here's how foster care works. So when a child enters foster care, it's never their fault. It's some sort of abuse or neglect they faced, and the biological family needs some kind of time and space to work on themselves. And so when a child goes into foster care and lives with a foster family, 50% of the time, that child might go to a couple foster homes, but while the biological family is working on themselves, but 50% of the time they move back home. They move back with their biological family, and that's the story. What people don't know is 50% of the time, that isn't the story. 50% of the time they're like my kids, and they don't get to go back home. My kids actually lived in 7 different foster homes before actually we were their 7th home. So they bounced around quite a bit while the biological family was trying to become more stable, and it just didn't get to that point. And so what happens is, over time, you have kids like mine. Like I mentioned, my daughter was a week from turning 3 when we met. There are kids who have been in the foster care system waiting for the biological family to become stable, and they don't. And so then they're eligible for adoption. But what most people think is, well, I wanted a baby. Well, in foster care, you can't adopt a baby because at minimum it takes 2 years. So if you're looking, that's like one of the most common misnomers is people say, you didn't tell me how to adopt a baby, Marcy. And I'm like, because you can't. Like, that's not
Right.
what foster care is for. Like, foster care's primary goal is to reunify kids with their biological families. And so if you're going to become a foster parent, like, that has to be your number one objective. Now, there is a different license called adoption through foster care where you can get licensed like my husband and I did, and you say, I'm signing up to help kids that are either already legally free or nearly legally free to be adopted. And that's where the 120,000 children currently are, because they were in a foster home, the parents lost their rights, and these kids are just waiting. They're waiting in a foster home. They're part of our communities. They're at school with their kids. They're at churches. They're at the grocery store. They're all over the place. But we don't realize they're right among us, hoping and praying that someone adopts them.
Well, and there's also, and I don't want to correct, so if this is wrong, tell me, but aren't there also the kids that their family was great, but mom and dad might have been killed in a car accident or something like that? Did those kids fall into that
That
same
it's like
situation
you
too?
listened to my podcast. I recently had a guest on who they had several biological children, and then there was a sibling group of 7 whose biological mom and dad died in a car crash, and they adopted a sibling set of 7. So those kinds of scenarios do happen. So yeah, it could be abuse and neglect, or it could just be they're orphaned because of no fault of their own always, where the parents are no longer living.
Wow. So, one of the reasons why, when we received your nomination and we read through the information, normally there's, I think I told you this offline, but normally there's like an interview process where we sit down and we talk to you and we make sure you fit the criteria. But we looked at the documentation that came and it was just so very clear that you're making an impact on people and that it comes from a really personal place. So, it was an easy choice to accept your nomination as a change maker. But I really want to know, lots of people have things in their past that like motivate them to do something, but there's an old saying, there's 3 birds on a wire, 2 want to fly south for the winter, how many birds are left? And the answer is 3, because just because you want to do something doesn't mean you do it.
Right.
And so you feel so inspired that you, again, made a career out of it, have a podcast on it, wrote a book, and adopted 2 children. So that's a little bit stronger desire and motivation. What was it that made you decide you wanted to take the leap first with the 2 children and then into this as a career path?
Yeah, well, the leap actually with adopting our children was a fact-finding journey for 5 years, where my husband and I knew we wanted to adopt older kids, and we kept going, well, how do you do that? And the internet was a different spot. There's still very, I mean, there's better tools now, but they're not as prevalent to find how do you adopt kids that are older through foster care that are in our own backyard. And my husband was very compelled to say, Marcy, I want to help the Grandpa Sams in the world. He lived in our country. He lived in St. Louis. Like, how do we do this locally? And so that's what we were trying to find. And so when we finally found it, we just kind of fast tracked, took the classes. I had a really supportive employer who allowed me to miss board meetings. I was on the leadership team, and she was like, no, go do this. Like, go get your license. And we had support and from our friends and family in that way. But then what happened, fast forward several years, is it's the pandemic. I had COVID. I was isolated. I'm an extrovert. It was this hard time for me, like a dark time for me. And it made me do a lot of thinking. And I started paying more attention to some of the digital communications I was getting and some of the organizations that are in this space that email, and they're like, oh, can you help market by sending this on Facebook or sharing this in social media? And they were local organizations doing great work. But I thought, shoot, like my social media network is so much broader than local. And so how does this apply? Like, how do I target the people you're asking me to target while also not overwhelming my newsfeed, because people are like, Marcy, like that's not relevant to me, right? And so what happened is I kind of got tired of looking at these emails and saying someone should. And I had like literally a piece of paper, 3-hole punch paper, that I wrote down someone should. And it was like 10 different ways they should. And then what ended up happening is I had started a book a year earlier, and I used this online template that was supposed to be amazing, but it totally stifled my creativity. I stopped very soon in the process. So a year later, I'm thinking about it. I'm noodling on it. I'm in this church online Bible study on parenting. I'm a few minutes early. The woman leading the class I knew had published a book. So I thought, who better to ask than someone that's done this? So I asked her how she published. And instead of answering my question, she was like, well, are you thinking to write something? And I'm thinking, I have not said this out loud yet. Yes, because I'm not going to lie. And she explained to me how she had felt like she was supposed to write this parenting book because a neighbor loved the way that her kids were growing and thriving. And the neighbor said, can you write down like how you're parenting your kids? And she said, okay, sure. So she goes home, writes it down, but very quickly it loses interest. It goes on a bookshelf. 20 years later, she finds like this woman and her cross paths again, and the woman's children are grown and their lives are havoc. And this woman leading my class told me, she said, Marcy, I wondered in that moment, what if I had written that down for her like she asked me to? And so I left that parenting group that night, very eyes wide open, and was like, I heard what she said. I totally heard what she said. I don't want to be here in 20 years going, I wonder how many kids, because I'm like, that's a person. Like, that's their livelihood. That's their future. And so I went online and printed up August of 2020 on like a little grid. And I went with a pencil and I was like, I don't know how many words I need, but I'll make a daily goal. And I just wrote this whole thing out and I went to share with my husband and didn't look at my personal calendar. And so I was like, oh, honey, I kind of made this plan. But yeah, that first weekend, we're supposed to go on like an anniversary trip. Should I move my goal around? Like, am I doing it wrong? And I have the most supportive spouse on the planet. And he said, Marcy, we're just going to go to a library while we're out of town. And you're going to have book time because that's what you committed to and you're supposed to do this. So my 31-day plan to write the book got accomplished in 25 days.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thanks. It was quite an interesting feat.
You know, it's funny, some of the things. Number one, I was waiting for you to add the little I can't think of the words, but you said what happened was, I was waiting to hear. So what happened was, you know, the way that they sometimes say it for accentuation. But
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I heard this said one time. They said, do you know what the most expensive real estate in the world is? And I'm like, I'll bite. And they said, it's the graveyard. It's the businesses never started. It's the books never written. It's the mission never accomplished. And, you know, Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Right.
And so congrats to you for taking the shots and for doing those things. I want to ask, for those that are like considering this, how can your book help them, or what resources should they seek out to maybe navigate the waters or dip their toe in a little bit to see what might be for them?
Yeah, and that's a great and a common question. And my answer for that is recognizing that adoption is such a private choice. You don't typically hear of anyone you know adopting until they've declared who they're adopting, and you see on, you know, social media like, oh, they're like, this is a person, and you don't hear any of the before. And when my husband and I went through it was supposed to be 4 months, was 18 months with our kids through this legal risk placement, I blogged our experience as a way to say, I wonder what would happen if we could help kind of dispel some myths around this topic. And what
Was
I
that
learned,
a real-time blog? Like you were putting it out as you were going through it?
Yeah, it was. And it's still on my website. So you can actually, that's one of the resources I offer, is you can go through the ups and downs of my emotional journey. There are a couple ground rules. I never bad talk the bio parents, and you don't get to know why my kids were in foster care. And I think that's fair. You get to hear my story from my perspective. And so what I learned in blogging was my readership was high, but my interactions were low. And I thought, well, what is that about? And that's because this is such a private space. And so what I think is
scared to respond. Like they'll read it, but they don't know what to say.
You're thinking about this. And so for those that are in that space where they're like, I've been thinking, but we're not telling anyone, and we haven't even told our family yet, I am here for you. And you don't even have to like reach out and tell me. You can take my book. You can learn the 55 steps, because it takes a long kind of red tape process to adopt through foster care, and you can evaluate. And I take you through that in the book about what is your heart, what is your motivation, what are the risks and the fears you're facing, but also how about the children? Like, what are they? And a lot of times those fears, I'm too old, is one that's shared by both the potential adoptive parent and the adoptive child. Because the children feel like, well, I'm too old. And the caregiver feels like, well, I'm too old, right? There's all these excuses we make. And so I offer that resource. I also have the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption guide. So they actually have this wonderful PDF. It's on my website, and it's on their website as well. And it looks at private adoption, international adoption, and foster care adoption. They're also a partner in the foster care adoption space, but they provide information for people that are trying to decide, well, which path. What I can tell you on my landing page on my website is I carve out for you how much it costs and how long it takes to pursue different adoption methods. And foster care adoption usually costs you $0 to $2,500. And it's the fastest option. So for people that think, well, I want to adopt, but the financial piece is my barrier, foster care adoption is not a barrier for those reasons.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned Dave Thomas. So, and I know who you were talking about because we spoke offline, but Dave Thomas, like founder of Wendy's.
Wendy's restaurant.
Told me he was adopted
through foster care when he was young. And so as he became a successful business restaurateur, if you will, he decided to create a foundation to help kids in the same situation. And so their work across the country is really about partnering with existing social service agencies serving kids in foster care. And they have a method, they fund what's called a Wendy's Wonderful Recruiter, which is where they'll fund a recruiter to help kids that have been waiting in foster care far too long and the longest, and help them find a forever family the fastest way they can.
Wow, that's amazing. You hear so Changemakers for me, I want to share with you. Changemakers for me was about sharing these stories of people doing amazing things. And, you almost, again, forgive me, you almost arrogantly think, I really want this to inspire someone.
Mm,
And like I had no idea the impact that some of these stories would have on me. And your story is no different. It's just amazing to hear. Congratulations on your success. I want to do two things before we wrap up the interview. Number one, I'd like you to share, where people can go to get your book and hear your podcast. And by the way, if you're watching this, it's in the comments below so you can look. But I want you to hear it from Marcy herself. So how do they
sure.
get your book? How do they follow you on social media? And where do they get your podcast?
So my book is all over the place. It's ebook, audio, and paperback. So you can find me at your favorite places, including Target and Amazon. All of the different retailers that I'm distributed at are on my website, forgottenadoptionoption.com. So my Facebook group is the same. I have a book group and I have a private community for folks that are navigating this process. So if that's you, that you're thinking, I want to be able to ask questions but not tell everyone, you can either privately message me or just join my Forgotten Adoption Option community on Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn and on Instagram, and always I'm encouraged to hear people's stories. So I do a podcast twice a month where I interview adoptive parents and adopted children. And so it's a great opportunity to kind of dispel some things maybe you've never heard before, or just consider things you've never heard before. Like, I've never thought about adopting a teenager and how that would go. So and I'm on several platforms with that one, Apple, Spotify. You can find my podcast anywhere as well.
All right. One last question before I give you the final 20 seconds to kind of wrap it up. Do you have any success stories where people have reached out to you and said, oh my gosh, I read your book, I've made this decision or something like that you're comfortable and have permission to share?
Yeah, I do. I can tell you right now that I've only been out since November, really focused on this. I've had over 2,000 prospective families read my material, which means they're thinking about it. And who knows if it will take them 6 months or a year. In my head, I thought, okay, it's going to be at least a year before I really get to meet the face of a child that has been impacted by this, right? And so I can tell you candidly and confidently that on a national scale, I have over 10 families that are currently going through the licensing process, and they're reaching out to me and sharing how that goes. And they're being honest. Like I have a gentleman who reached out, he and his wife had an infertility story, and they had to really deal with their own heart before ever moving forward with adoption because they had to deal with that grief, right? And he shared with me, he said, Marcy, I feel like I have had a follow-up with a social worker. It's super disorganized, all these other negative things. I kind of want to get out of the line. I have the resources. I think I want to go pay for private, but something's holding me here. And I validated him and said, number one, you're not crazy. Everything you just said is the process. It's a government program, right? I mean, do you see billboards for food stamps? You don't. Like, there's no marketing around government programs, folks. So like, it doesn't run smooth, right? But what you have to recognize with foster care adoption is you have 120,000 kids. You're like at the grocery store and they're at the end of that line. And unfortunately, you got on the bad cashier line. Like, your cashier's kind of slow and you kind of want to get out of there and you want to change lines, but you got to remember that's not about the cashier. It's about the kids at the end of the line that are waiting for you.
Right. Wow. Well stated. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to just share any final thoughts that you have, and then we'll close out the interview. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I think the best way I can leave people, you mentioned maybe they get inspired. And to me, one of the best pieces of advice that has really pushed me forward is to go where the energy is. And so surrounding myself and surrounding yourself, I'd encourage you with people that encourage you, and they're not fluffy. They'll shoot it to you real, but they're not people that say don't and you can't, but they're people that say just do it or just try. And even when you make a mistake, you misspell a word in public or you slip on something, whatever it is, you have a cheering squad that says, but you tried. And so I would really encourage people to really pay attention to who you're surrounding yourself with.
That's great. Great advice. Marcy, thanks so much for being here with us.
You're welcome.
What a compelling story. Guys, remember that you have a chance to donate in support of these change makers. You can make a donation to ReVitalize. ReVitalize is a licensed 501c3. You can visit our website, which is, of course, the www.thejimandlarryteam.com, and you can go to /changemakers after that, and you will be able to find the link to all the change makers, their stories, and how to make a donation. The donation will go to ReVitalize, which again is the 501c3. We are honored that you chose to watch this interview with Marcy Bursac. And there is more to come. Keep looking. Look in the comments. You'll see all her contact details. Thanks for watching.